greenhouse gases, AHSC seeks to support and maximize several community outcomes around the economy, environment, and public health, what we refer to as co-benefits. And so this is all really part of what makes this program so unique. We like to say AHSC incentivizes looking beyond the parcel, seeing how the impact of extending benefits beyond the housing site results in all of those important community enhancements we just discussed. AHSC is also unique in the way that it incentivizes cross-sector partnerships in order to create a truly holistic project. We stress this a lot, that the most successful projects are built on the strength of these partnerships. So every partner has something that they can contribute, and recognizing that and building off of it is truly critical for a successful application. Also keep in mind that not every partner necessarily needs to be a formal partner or a formal applicant. Eligible applicants include developers, public agencies, and transit agencies, but there is flexibility regarding how these partners interact and how formal they want their relationship to be. All right, so let's dig in. One of the first things that we want to do when assessing a project's readiness for AHSC is to look to whether it meets the program's list of specific thresholds. This is not a comprehensive list, but it does include the items we run up against most frequently that are sort of make it or break it things to consider. So first, you need all entitlements and land use approvals, excluding design review, completed by time of application. So if you were looking to apply it in round 6, for example, the time of application would be February 2021. For the housing portion of the application, you'll need to have any external environmental reviews such as CEQA and NEPA completed by the same February deadline. Transportation projects need to have environmental clearances by grant dispersal, which is usually the fall of the award year. All projects need to have site control by time of application. That's that second item here. And then lastly, you must have at least 90% of your total development costs committed by time of application. And that sounds like a lot, and it is, but keep in mind that you're able to count your AHSC funding ask and the transportation costs and committed funding in this calculation. And historically, 4% tax credits have also counted in this calculation. Okay, so continue with the readiness or with the threshold items. So AHSC can only fund projects that have not started construction and requires that projects be completed within 5 years of signing the standard agreement. And then finally, and this isn't necessarily a threshold item, but I just wanted to briefly explain AHSC's legal requirements. Because AHSC requires that both housing and transportation projects be included in the application, the multiple parties will be responsible for building those projects and will have certain legal obligations. So you can structure your application in more than one way. The different parties can apply as either joint applicants, or you can include a commitment to enter into a contractual agreement if the funds are awarded. Okay, so now let's turn to the program's project area types. Unlike other funding programs, the AHSC does not have geographic set-asides, but rather categorizes projects into 3 eligible project area types. So the first one here is transit-oriented development, or TOD. We also have integrated connectivity projects, or ICPs, and then the Rural Innovation Project Area, or RIPA. Projects only compete with other projects in their respective categories. These project types are differentiated by specific qualifying transit requirements. So to qualify as a TOD, a project has to be served by high quality transit, which means it must have peak period headway frequency of every 15 minutes or less, and service 7 days a week. It also has to have permanent infrastructure like railway and bus-only lanes. ICPs cannot be served by high-quality transit, but must be within half a mile of a transit station or stop, with transit that departs 2 times during peak hours. And finally, projects in the RIPA category have the same transit requirements as an ICP, but in rural areas. Since fixed transit service is not always available in rural areas, flexible transit service is a common option for rural sites to have qualifying transit. To learn more about ASIC applications in rural areas, you can tune in to the rural webinar on Thursday, May 21st. I also wanted to note that a project defaults to the highest level of transit service. So you can't really choose to be an ICP if you also qualify as a TOD. The program sets aside a certain percentage of the total ASIC funds available for each project area type. So in round 5, this was the proportion of total funding allocated to each project area type. As you can imagine, the ICP category tends to have a higher number of qualifying projects competing. To accommodate that, the state actually increased the set aside in round 5 to 45%. Each project area type also has a threshold net density requirement. And these were the round 5 net density requirements for residential projects. And finally, these were the average net densities achieved by projects in round 5. So as you can see, the average net density is higher than the threshold net density. So you should consider this when crafting a competitive application. Okay, so the last requirement we'll talk about before jumping into what we can fund with ASIC, which I think is the fun part, is the level of project affordability. So ASIC requires that 20% of a housing project be restricted, or that it be affordable to low or very low income households. Of the restricted units, you have to have an average AMI of up to 50%. All right, so let's turn our attention to the award amounts and how the awards are divided among the different components of the project scope. The maximum request for a project in round 5 was 30 million, which had gone up from 20 million in round 4. And then the average request for all applications in round 5 was 22 million. This shows how a total project request is typically divided between the different components of the ASIC application. So there are 2 requirements for how you spend your request. One is that at least 50% of your total request be spent on housing. And you are also limited to a 10 million cap on your transportation costs. Typically, a bit more than 50% of the total request is allocated for housing, and the remainder goes to the transportation and programmatic components of the application. There are a few other considerations for sizing your total request. The first one is pretty straightforward. You'll have to calculate how much you can ask for each restricted unit per the HCD loan limit guide. The next 2 points relate to the program's scoring criteria, which we haven't covered yet. But I wanted to quickly mention that your request will take into account the points allocated for dedicating a certain proportion of your total request to transportation projects. So for a simplified example, if you're trying to maximize points in this category, let's say your total ASIC funding request was $10, then for full points, $2.50 or 25% of that total request would need to go to the transportation scope. There are also points allocated for the GHG efficiency score, which calculates your total GHG reduction per ASIC dollar request. So there is some incentive for keeping your total requests low, especially if your GHG reductions aren't very high. All right, so what does ASIC actually fund? These are the program funding categories, and I'll provide examples in the following slides. So funds for housing are broken out into two categories. There's funds for AHD, or affordable housing development, and for HRI costs, which are housing-related infrastructure. The latter is any infrastructure cost being required by a locality as a condition of approval for the development itself, like sewer or utility systems upgrades. Typically, the developer is the entity managing scoping decisions around these items. Next, we have what we refer to as STIs, or Sustainable Transportation Infrastructure. These are actual capital improvements like sidewalks, bike lanes, transit capital items that facilitate mode shifts, so they allow people to utilize them for transportation needs versus a car. And these costs, usually because they tend to fall into the public right-of-way, are again, typically but not always, managed by a public agency. Next up, we have TRAs, or transit-related amenities. I always describe these as items that enhance the use of the STI item. So things like street trees, bus shelters, bike parking. And these are usually managed by public agency partners. And finally, we have PGM funds, or for program costs. And so AHSC will fund operating expenses for up to 3 years for programs, and an amount up to $500,000. In addition, AHSC requires that at least one transit pass per unit be provided to residents. These passes can be no more than 50% of the cost of a typical transit pass, and you can use AHSC to cover this cost. As you may have noticed, the AHSC program funds capital projects through either loans or grants. AHSC AHD funds will be provided as a loan, and all other funds will be provided as grants and paid out as reimbursements. Okay, so here are some examples of STIs. Notice that eligible costs include active transportation improvements, as well as new public transit improvements. So you have, new and improved bikeways and pedestrian walkways. You can also include traffic calming measures, transit improvements, like BRT infrastructure, as well as the purchase of new transit vehicles. And then I also wanted to note that transit operations can also be funded in the STI budget. This is actually a change that was made in round 5. So it's a pretty recent change. Here are some examples of TRAs. So, you can include streetscape improvements like lighting and urban greening, as well as street furniture and bike infrastructure, as well as station and stop improvements. And then finally, here are some examples of programs. So you can use AHSC to cover active transportation programs. You can do a community transit pass program, workforce development, air pollution, and car share programs. All right, so through AHSC's 4 rounds so far, more than $1 billion has been invested in housing and transportation improvements throughout the state. As I discussed earlier, the maximum amount increased from 20 million to 30 million between round 4 and 5. And we're not sure what the max amount will be for round 6. You'll also see that the NOFA amount in round 5 was 550 million. And right now, the round 6 NOFA has at least 75 million available, but there is one more auction to go before the final NOFA amount is determined. Okay, so we mentioned that AHSC seeks to invest its funding into disadvantaged communities. In fact, there is a programmatic requirement that at least 50% of AHSC funding go toward projects identified as being in a DAC. These communities are identified at the census tract level through a statewide tool called CalEnviroscreen. For those who aren't familiar, CalEnviro produces a percentile score based on a combination of many different socioeconomic and environmental factors like poverty and housing need and asthma rates. If your project falls within a census tract that scores in the top 25% of the index, then you are in a DAC. We do want to stress that while DAC communities are important, being outside of a DAC is not a reason to think that you're not competitive or ineligible to apply for funds. We routinely see projects outside of DACs awarded each year. So again, if your project isn't in a DAC, don't tune out. Okay, so part of your application requires putting your scope on a map. There are specific instructions that the state releases on how to complete this portion of the application. The project area map is important because it's how application reviewers confirm some of your points and threshold requirements. So here we're going to show you an example of how you will develop your project area map. Okay, so you're going to start by identifying the housing site and then the qualifying transit station or stop that has to be within a half-mile walking distance of your housing site. Typically, there's already qualifying transit close to your housing site, but if not, you can actually use AHSC to pay for and bring qualifying transit to your project area. Then we create what we call the preliminary project area, which is determined by a 1 mile radius around your qualifying transit stop or station. Then we identify the project's STI improvements. In this example, we've identified a new walkway and a new bike lane. And then we draw a half-mile radius around those two improvements. And finally, we will merge the buffers to create the final project area. You can see how this project expanded its project area buffer a bit with some additional sidewalk and bike lane improvements. If you're concerned about your organization's mapping capacity, the TA team can help connect you with mapping providers. Okay, so now I will pass it on to my colleague Alejandro, who's going to talk about the scoring and best practices.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So as Julia said, I'm Alejandro, Program Director for Enterprise based out of our Los Angeles office. Thanks for signing up to attend today's event. You might have missed it at the beginning, but we want to also thank the State Strategic Growth Council for sponsoring today's event. In fact, we have a staff member who is on this call, and we'll provide his contact information later. So as Julia said, now on to what makes an application competitive. So while points are allocated for important housing and transportation components, remember, as Julia said earlier, that your GHG score is important. A total of 100 points are available on an AHSC application divided into GHG points, the policy points, and narrative points. Unlike other programs, you are not expected to get 100 points. That's only the max. For example, in round 4, the range of scores for all awarded projects was between 67 and 89. So before I move on, the next webinar series in June will go into more detail on some of the most challenging scoring components of the AHSC application. So you'll want to tune into those. First and foremost, 30 of the 100 points are based on the project's GHG emissions reductions and GHG efficiency ratio. As you can see, projects are scored on number 1, how many GHG emissions they are reducing per AHSC dollar, and number 2, the total number of emissions they are reducing divided into 15 points each. At 30% of the overall points on the application, you can see how important the GHG score is. To remind everybody, you will only compete with other projects in the same project area type. So, for example, if you're a rural project, you will not compete against a TOD project. Okay, so how do you actually improve your GHG score? First, let's start with your housing components. So you can increase your GHG reductions by having a high-density, mixed-use building with limited parking and solar PV. Keep in mind that only affordable units are accounted for the GHG calculations, so having more than the minimum 20% number of units may help increase your GHG reductions. The GHG webinar in June will go over the details of the AHSC GHG benefit calculations. So the second bucket of GHG reductions comes from transportation improvements. The largest GHG emissions reductions are likely to come from a new transit component that leads to significant ridership increase. So it's important that you start working early with your local transit providers to see if there is actually an opportunity to use AHSC funds to help purchase, I'll just give you some examples, transit vehicles or build new dedicated bus lanes or other capital improvements. The transit partner will be responsible for calculating the transit ridership projections. It's important to note here that a transit agency partner does not need to be a joint applicant, but you'll need an executed agreement with the transit partner as part of the application. It's important to note also that while new bike and pedestrian improvements will also yield GHG emissions reductions, their GHG reductions are often very small compared to a transit piece. Okay, next we'll talk about the quantitative policy points. So the quantitative policy points are the biggest chunk of the application score. Of the 55 points, many will come from your transportation improvements, shown here as indicated with the icons of the bicycle and the transit vehicle. Specifically, you'll be given points based on your proposed bike and ped improvements in your application. These are worth 10 points. As you can see on this slide, you can also earn up to 9 points for allocating specific portions of your total AHSC request to your STI and TRA budgets. This is known as the project's housing and transportation collaboration. As Julia mentioned earlier, leverage funds are also important. You get up to 4 points depending on how much of your funding is not AHSC, including leveraged funds from transportation improvements. Lastly, you can also use the program eligible cost category to purchase transit passes for the community or to create active transportation programs. The last bucket of points comes from your narrative, up to 5 points. Your narrative must address these sections: collaboration and planning with partners, how your project provides a community benefit and engagement, and finally, how your application addresses community climate resiliency and air pollution. And I'll note here that the narrative is a 6-page document that will be uploaded as part of your application. Finally, as shown on this slide, you'll see that your active transportation improvements contribute to these sections of the narrative. So it's important to start thinking early about possible active transportation ideas in your project area. Now we'll talk a little bit about community engagement. With the highest number of possible points on the narrative itself, meaningful and robust community engagement is crucial for a successful AHSC application. To learn how to maximize these points, you'll want to listen into the community engagement webinar on June 16th. But for now, start connecting with local CBOs and other hard-to-reach community members to assess needs. A successful AHSC application will show how the project addresses community needs. The most important lesson for a competitive application is to develop strong partnerships between the housing developers and public partners to identify mutually beneficial projects. So start conversations early. Find out who your transit partners are. Another best practice is to begin identifying possible active transportation projects to incorporate into your application by looking at existing plan documents. Thankfully, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And remember, stay in touch with each other. Now I'll go and show you a little bit of some examples from previous rounds of successful projects. So hopefully these case studies will show you how important it is to bring in community benefits on an AHSC application. So the first project that we'll show you as a case study is the 500 Turk Street project, which was a successful round 4 TOD project. As you can see from the slide, this is a very high density, 100% affordable project being built on what was previously a parking lot. The project includes 2,384 square feet of commercial space for a neighborhood serving retail. The total request on this application was $20 million. Next, I'll show you more details about this project. So 500 Turk is located in one of the busiest bus corridors in the city of San Francisco, and is also on the city's high injury corridor. So there were lots of opportunities to improve the reliability and safety of transportation here. AHSC dollars funded important transportation improvements such as a BART station entrance canopy. In addition, in partnership with SFMTA, AHSC dollars helped fund BRT improvements such as sidewalk improvements, bulb outs, and transit-only lanes. These capital improvements ended up having significant GHG reductions. For the program components, the project paid for 4 corner captains and provided safety trainings to the community. As you can see by the narrative description here on this slide, all of these transit improvements came together to create a cohesive AHSC project. Next, I'll move on to Grandview Village, which is an example of an ICP project area type in the city of Stockton that was awarded in round 4. Grandview Village will provide 63 units of affordable housing. The applicant had submitted for the same project in the prior 3 rounds of AHSC, but on its 4th try partnered with a regional commuter rail service and was able to contribute AHSC dollars toward the purchase of a rail car. This new transit element's GHG reductions help improve the application's score significantly. The AHSC application also included an active transportation education program. So a little bit more detail about Grandview Village. So the total request on that application was over $17 million, split between the housing, purchase of a passenger rail car, and over 2 miles of new bike lanes and 3 miles of new walkways. The application also included transit-related amenities, i.e. new bus shelters, that will also help community members connect to the downtown transit center and train station, which in turn will help communities connect to vital health care, education, and employment centers. The rail car, combined with substantive active transportation elements and public transit infrastructure, all played an important role in creating a comprehensive and winning application. Lastly, I'll show you an example of a RIPA project. So this successful rural project, the OCOTILLO Springs project in Imperial County, was awarded over $12 million to help fund 75 units of affordable housing. The applicant had an innovative net zero building and incorporated a pedestrian and bicycling safety education program. The project also used AHSC to help fund the construction of over 1.6 miles of new sidewalks and 2.3 miles of bikeways. The winning formula for this RIPA was to include these new sidewalks, bikeways, and purchase of 30 van-pool vans, which resulted in substantial GHG reductions. The OCOTILLO Springs project will help reduce vehicle use for farm workers and help address inequities in access in Brawley. Now I will go through the AHSC timeline and end by allowing for 15 minutes to answer any questions that haven't been answered through the chat. Please keep in mind that we will send a Q&A document to all participants after this webinar. So if your questions don't get answered now, we'll answer them then. So here's a broad overview of the AHSC timeline. The grant cycle is annual, meaning that every year the NOFA comes out in early November and the application is due the following February. So for example, for round 6, the draft ASIC guidelines will come out in the late December time period, and after a comment period is over, the final guidelines are adopted around October, followed quickly thereafter by the NOFA and application release. After applications are submitted in February, awards will be adopted in June. Now to focus on what applicants should be doing to prepare for a potential ASIC application. If you've reviewed whether or not your project can achieve the program threshold, we can recommend that you start engaging with your partners around now through summer and start brainstorming bike and pedestrian scope ideas. Second, while this can start earlier, we encourage you to use the fall period to gather input from the community, and from there until December, you should be finalizing your ASIC budget and bike, ped, and transit scope. Finally, you'll want to make sure you dedicate January to the narrative and finalizing the GHG inputs. After applications are submitted, there will be a brief break until April when you get your threshold determination letters and initial point score letters. You will be able to appeal these determinations. So finally, wrapping up here for some next steps that we recommend. If you are interested in applying for round 6 and need technical assistance, please sign up for the SGC email listserv because they will send a questionnaire in the fall for applicants interested in receiving free technical assistance. Or alternatively, you could contract with a TA provider. But in the meantime, start looking at whether your project can achieve the ASIC threshold and start connecting with potential project partners. Last but not least, start now. It's never too early to start preparing for the next ASIC round. So Julie and I thank you for listening to this presentation. Here's our contact information if you have any specific questions. You'll notice that each of us at Enterprise works in a specific region, and that team is listed here. Is Julia for the Bay Area, me, Alejandro, for Southern California, and all the regions are Christine, whom has been moderating our chat, so you might have seen her name already. We're also providing the contact at SGC, Chet, whose email is on this slide. Friendly reminder that we'll send follow-up information with links to the SGC ASIC website and listserv. Now we'll go to your questions. So someone had a question earlier about site control. So there's 2 categories of site control. One is for, as I said, the housing itself, and the guidelines list things like DDAs and ENAs. Essentially, the state just wants to ensure that you will have the site control by the time of application. And then there you also have to have site control for the transportation improvements. Now, since those transportation improvements are usually in the public right-of-way, those are usually handled by the public agencies insofar as they can attest to the fact that those projects are in fact in the public right-of-way and they have site control for those projects.
Hey everyone, this is Christine, friendly Zoom chat monitor. Just to also highlight some of the recurring questions we saw come up. So a couple questions around the enforceable funding commitment and counting 4% tax credits. So just reiterating, based on how all prior program rounds have gone, we know there's some discussion currently about how the 4% program will be advancing, but previously you have been able to count your 4% estimated commitment as committed, even if you do not yet have those that tax credit award in hand. And so that's been a key player in ensuring projects can meet the 90% enforceable funding commitment threshold. There were also a few questions related to items that would fall under the broader soft cost category. So ASIC does have a limit on reports, planning, and design that would fall under that soft cost category. It is a program that is intended to fund development and construction, but if you have soft costs attributable to developing those projects, they typically can't be included as long as they fall under that existing limit. And then it looks like we're getting some more generalized questions here that I'm happy to run through. So again, yes, confirming that both the recorded version of the presentation and a copy of the slides will be shared with all attendees, hopefully by the end of this week, so keep an eye out there. A question about a list of TA providers in the Los Angeles area. So I would recommend reaching out directly to Alejandro, whose email is listed here on this final slide, and you can start a conversation about who to reach out to in the Southern California region. Another question about senior projects. So I did note in the chat that senior projects were at a competitive disadvantage in prior rounds based on the way the state considered them under the greenhouse gas methodology. So that meant they just generally were achieving less reductions compared to other projects. Our understanding is that that methodology has been revised going into this most recent round. So I still think senior projects are assessed separately. So we would really need to look at your individual project site to see, what your density is, how many units you have, and what potential non-housing projects can be paired with your site to, I think, give a better understanding. I don't know that we can just blanket across the board say that senior projects are less competitive, because the state did respond to that by making some revisions. A question here about whether awards are made to mixed income projects. So yes, we have seen mixed income projects successfully receive awards. So happy to talk more about that if you reach out to one of us. Continuing along, public agencies as co-applicants. So Julia mentioned this earlier on. Public agencies do not need to explicitly be formal joint applicants. However, in the case where a public agency does not wish to be a joint applicant, they do need to execute a separate agreement with the primary applicant, typically an affordable housing developer, that states the public agency commits to entering into a contract to develop whatever portion of the scope it will be responsible for should funding be received. So it's a little more than a letter of support. It needs to be a little more formal than that, but it does need to state that you are committing to execute the work. What a general project around the type of transit projects that achieve the best greenhouse gas reductions. I definitely recommend you join the greenhouse gas focused webinar later in June, but this is tied to ridership numbers. I don't want to get too wonky, but if we're looking at capital projects or the program will now fund transit operations up to 2 years, but improvements that really drive ridership estimate increase.
This is Alejandro. Let me just add a little bit to that. One of the interesting questions there is capital improvement projects. So these are things, for example, like new transit stations, new transit stops, or even adding on to multimodal hubs. Those tend to have the higher GHG reductions because, for example, if you're building a multimodal hub, it's bringing in together the transit systems of many bus routes, et cetera. So you then have a lot of ridership increase from that. So as Christine said, it's really the most important factor is transit improvements that increase ridership are the ones that are going to have the most GHG reductions. So you'll want to make sure you test those on the calculator. Go ahead, Christine.
Thank you. Thanks, Alejandro. And then we have a question just reviewing some of the readiness thresholds. So land use approvals, excluding design review, your CEQA, your NEPA, and site control for the housing portion all need to be in hand by the time of application submittal, which for round 6 would be February 2021. Transportation projects, at least on the environmental side, do not need to have their clearances in hand by February. They need them by the time of grant dispersal, which, as Julia mentioned, is typically fall of the award year. So that would generally be fall of 2021 is what we would estimate. And then we have a question about if a city does a joint, if you do an so that side agreement, you're not a formal joint applicant, are you a party to the standard agreement, which is the agreement executed with the state following award? So our engagement typically ends after you are awarded, and this can be a question we run by HCD and follow up when we send out the formal chat Q&A that will be accompanying the recording and the presentation slides. So unless one of my teammates has a explicit answer to that, I think we need to check with the state.
That's fine.
Yep. I wanted to mention one last thing. Just wanted to encourage everyone to sign up for the AHSC listserv for all the most up-to-date information on AHSC, including awards, public comment periods, and draft guideline releases. And I'm sharing the link here with everyone now, but we'll make sure to include this in all of the follow-up material.
Okay, we've got 4 minutes left, so the TA team here will remain on the line, but again, you will receive the recording, copy of all the slides, and we will be putting all of your chat questions into a more formalized Q&A document that will also be shared out. You're welcome to contact any one of us if you have project-specific questions or you'd like some more information. We are available to chat. And with that, just want to thank you all for your time, bearing with us as we all navigate this new world of communal technology. And I think we'll be seeing some of you on some of the future webinars. So we look forward to that.
Thank you all for joining.
Thank you. We'll wait for another 3 minutes if there's any other questions.
Okay. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
So the round 6 guidelines, the draft guidelines, will usually come out in around August, and it's usually there's a little bit of a comment period, and as I said on a timeline earlier toward the end of the presentation, those are finalized. So look for the draft round 6 guidelines in August, and those will typically be adopted, as I said in the presentation, around October.
Okay, so we are out of time. I wanted to thank everyone again for joining us, and please sign up for the other webinars that are scheduled for the rest of this week. There's one next week, and then there are a few in June. Please feel free to reach out to us if you need any of the registration links for those webinars. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.